The last thing my grandfather ever said to me was that he was fine. He wasn't fine. He was dying in a hospice bed in rural Virginia with no one in the room except me, and a nurse named Carol who smelled like eucalyptus and spoke to him like he was already gone. His breathing had that particular quality, shallow and uneven, like a car engine running out of fuel. I held his hand and told him I wasn't going anywhere. He turned his head slightly toward me, and for just a moment, his eyes focused. He said, "You didn't have to come." I said, "I know." That was the last real conversation we had. My mother didn't come. My aunt didn't come. My uncle, who lived 40 minutes away in Fredericksburg, sent a card. An actual paper card with a generic mountain scene on the front and a printed message inside, as though condolences were something you could order online and have delivered before the person was even dead. There was no handwritten note, just his printed name at the bottom. James. I have thought about that card more times than I can count. My grandfather's name was Walter Greer. He was 79 years old when he died, and he had lived alone in a small house outside of Culpeper for the last 11 years of his life. He drove himself to the grocery store until he was 76. He mowed his own lawn until the spring of the year he died, when his knees finally refused to cooperate. He didn't ask for help. He didn't complain. He made his own meals, kept his own schedule, and called me every Sunday at 7 in the evening because he knew I'd be home. He called every Sunday for 4 years. That's the part that undoes me when I think about it now. 4 years of Sunday calls, and not once did he call my mother. Not once did he reach out to the aunt who lived 2 states away and posted photos of her garden on Facebook every other day. He called me because I was the only one who answered. I was 28 when he died. I am 31 now, and I still think about Walter every single day. I want to tell you about the thing I found in his house. I want to tell you what happened because of it, what it cost me, what it gave back, and what it made me understand about a man I thought I knew but had only ever seen the surface of. There are people in this world who carry their entire lives in silence, and you will never know the weight of what they're holding unless you happen to stumble into the right room at the right moment. I stumbled, and what I found changed everything. Walter Greer grew up in a small town in western North Carolina. He was the second of 4 children. The kind of boy who was quiet in a way that adults always described as well-behaved, but was really something else entirely, a watchfulness, a way of observing the room before deciding whether to be in it. He enlisted in the army at 18 and did 2 tours in Vietnam before I was born. That much I knew. He talked about Vietnam occasionally, in the way that people talk about weather briefly, without drama, moving on before you could ask a follow-up question. What he didn't talk about was everything that came after. He married my grandmother Eleanor in 1974, and they had 2 children, my mother, Christine, and her brother James, the one who sent the card. My grandmother died when I was 7, and I remember her mostly as warmth and the smell of biscuits. After she died, my grandfather became someone the family seemed to find easier to keep at a comfortable distance. My mother had reasons, she said. Old arguments, things he'd done and not done when she was young. I heard the outline of these reasons many times growing up, but never the full story, because full stories require 2 people willing to tell them, and my grandfather never told his side of anything. I spent 2 weeks in Culpeper after the hospice. There were things to sort through, papers to file, a house to empty. My mother agreed to come down for a single weekend, and she moved through his rooms with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a task they resented. She took the things she wanted, a lamp, 2 boxes of old photographs, my grandmother's china, and left the rest for me to deal with. On the Sunday after she left, I started going through the back bedroom closet. It was mostly what you'd expect. Old coats, a box of tax returns from the 1990s, a broken alarm clock he'd never thrown away, for reasons known only to him. I worked through the shelves methodically, making piles keep, donate, trash, and I was on my 3rd hour when I found the metal box on the highest shelf, pushed to the back behind a folded wool blanket. It was a standard lockbox, gunmetal gray, the kind you can buy at any hardware store. It wasn't locked. Inside were several folded documents, a few old photographs I didn't recognize, a small leather journal with no writing on the cover, and a challenge coin. I didn't know what a challenge coin was at the time. I'd seen them before in a vague way. I knew they were military, knew veterans carried them, but I'd never held one. This one was heavy for its size, about the diameter of a 50-cent piece but thicker, and it was dark bronze or brass, worn smooth at the edges from handling. On one side there was an eagle with its wings spread, and below it a set of letters I didn't recognize arranged in a particular way. On the other side were numbers and what looked like it might be a unit designation, but worn so smooth I couldn't read it clearly. I turned it over in my fingers for a long time. I didn't think too much of it that day. Military men had coins. My grandfather had been in the military. I put it in my pocket with the vague intention of looking it up later, and kept emptying the closet. It was the journal that kept me up that night. I want to be careful about what I share from that journal, because some of it is not mine to share. But I'll tell you this, my grandfather wrote in it irregularly, sometimes years apart, and what he wrote was not a diary in the conventional sense. He didn't record events. He recorded what things felt like a sentence here, a paragraph there, written in the precise and somewhat formal style of a man who had learned to be sparing with words. There was an entry from 1989, one from 1994, several from the early 2000s. And near the back, written in a slightly shakier hand, one from 2019, 3 years before he died. The 2019 entry was 6 lines long. I've read it so many times I have it memorized. He wrote about getting older and finding that he was less afraid of death than he had expected to be. He wrote that the thing he regretted was not the things he had done, but the things he had failed to explain. He wrote, "I should have found a way to tell them. I don't know why I couldn't." I think I believed that living it was enough proof. I was wrong about that. I sat on the floor of his bedroom and read that entry 3 times. Then I called my mother. It was late, almost 11, but she answered. I told her about the box, about the journal, about the coin. I asked her if she knew anything about what her father had done after Vietnam, whether there was any military service she'd never told me about, any reason he might have documents that appeared to be classified or restricted. There was a long pause. She said, "He was in the army. He did 2 tours. That's all I know." I said, "There's more than that, Mom. There's a box full of things I can't identify." She said, "He was a very private person." That was her answer. A very private person, as though privacy explained a lockbox on a high shelf and an entry in a journal about failing to explain. I want to be fair to my mother. She had a complicated relationship with her father, and I don't know the full shape of it. I know there was distance. I know there were years of minimal contact. I know she had her reasons, and I also know that by the time I was old enough to understand that something was wrong between them, the distance had calcified into something neither of them seemed interested in crossing. But I also know that on the day her father died, she was 300 miles away. I started making calls. The first few weeks were frustrating in the way that bureaucratic research is always frustrating forms that led to other forms, phone numbers that rang without answer, a VA records office that told me the process for requesting service records could take several months. I filed what I could. I waited. I kept the coin on my desk and found myself picking it up whenever I was thinking, turning it over in my fingers the way my grandfather must have done. In the meantime, I started going through the photographs from the box. Most of them were unmarked on the back, which is an infuriating habit of people from that generation. They knew who everyone was, so they saw no reason to write it down, and now there's no one left to ask. But a few had dates, and from those dates I started building a rough timeline. There were photographs from what appeared to be Southeast Asia, not Vietnam, somewhere else, somewhere with a different quality of light and different vegetation. There were photographs of men in civilian clothes who held themselves the way military men hold themselves. There was one photograph of my grandfather, younger than I'd ever seen him, standing next to a man I didn't recognize, both of them squinting into a bright sun, and written on the back in pencil, almost too faded to read, T and W, October 1971. October 1971. He'd enlisted in 1968. His first tour officially ended in 1970. The math didn't add up. It was my coworker, a woman named Deanna, whose father had been in the Marine Corps, who told me to look up the coin more carefully. She said challenge coins often had identifying information if you knew how to look, and that veterans organizations sometimes had databases for them. She also said, more gently, that if my grandfather had served in a capacity that involved classified operations, some records might not exist in any public database at all. There are people, she said, who did things for this country that this country will never officially acknowledge. I thought about the journal entry, the things he failed to explain. I thought about how my grandfather had lived for 11 years alone in that house, calling me on Sundays, mowing his own lawn, never asking for anything. I thought about the card from my uncle with no handwritten note. I started to feel something I hadn't expected to feel. Not grief. Exactly, I'd already done a lot of that. Something more like anger on his behalf. A retroactive outrage that arrived 3 months after his death and hit me sideways one morning while I was making coffee. He had deserved better. Whatever he'd done, and wherever he'd done it, he had deserved better than a card with a mountain scene and an empty house. The Fort Belvoir Heritage Ceremony happens every year in October, and I went because Deanna's husband was receiving a commendation and she invited me. I wore my grandfather's coin on a chain around my neck. I'd had it fitted on a loop a few weeks earlier, partly as a way of feeling close to him, and partly because I didn't want to keep it in a box. I wore a navy dress and my good heels, and I drove down in the early morning, and I didn't expect that day to change anything. There was a reception after the formal ceremony, held in a long room with high ceilings and photograph-lined walls. I was standing near the back with a glass of water, watching Deanna talk to her husband's commanding officer, when I became aware that someone nearby had stopped moving. I turned. He was in his mid-70s, compact and straight-backed, in full-dress uniform with the kind of ribbon rack that takes up a significant portion of a chest. He was looking at the coin on my chain with an expression I can only describe as recognition, not mild interest, not polite curiosity, but the specific and intense focus of a person who has seen a thing they did not expect to see again. He looked up at my face. He said, "Where did you get that?" His voice was quiet. It was not aggressive or accusatory. It was the voice of a person asking a question they needed the answer to. I said, "It was my grandfather's." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "What was your grandfather's name?" I told him. "Walter Greer." The man closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something different in his face, not grief, but the particular expression of someone absorbing information they had been carrying for a long time without knowing where to put it. He said, "Walter Greer from North Carolina." I said yes. He said, "Is he still alive?" I said no. I told him he had passed the previous spring. I watched the man nod slowly, the way people nod when they're trying to keep their composure in public. He introduced himself. His name was Colonel Richard Marsh, retired. He said he knew my grandfather. He said that was an understatement. Actually, he said that Walter Greer had, on a specific occasion he was not entirely at liberty to describe in detail, made a decision that had directly resulted in Richard Marsh being alive and standing in that room. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I will tell you what he told me, as best I can, within the limits of what he felt he could share. My grandfather had not left the army after his second official tour in Vietnam. He had been recruited into a unit that was, to use Colonel Marsh's phrasing, not part of the conventional record. He served in this capacity through the mid-1970s, operating primarily in Southeast Asia, doing work that was classified at a level that meant his service was effectively invisible, no unit patch on his uniform because there was no official unit, no documentation that would survive any standard records request, no official acknowledgement of anything he did or anywhere he went. He left that service in 1978. He came home to North Carolina. He met my grandmother. He became, by all outward appearances, a man who had done 2 tours in Vietnam and settled down. What he had actually done, in those invisible years, was something his government had asked him to do in complete silence. And in complete silence he had kept it, for 44 years. I asked Colonel Marsh if my grandfather had ever spoken to him after they served together. He said no. He said that was how it worked when it ended. It ended completely. He said he had thought about Walter Greer many times over the decades, had wondered where he was and whether he'd made a life for himself, and had never had any way to find out. I told him about the house in Culpeper, about the Sunday phone calls, about the card from my uncle with the mountain scene. Colonel Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I have written down and kept because I don't want to misremember it. He said, "The men I served with in that period, they were asked to be invisible, and most of them became invisible in every part of their lives, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't know how to stop. Walter was one of the best people I have ever known. I'm sorry he was alone." I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes after that. There are things I did after the ceremony that I don't regret, but that cost me relationships that mattered to me. I called my mother and told her everything Colonel Marsh had told me. I told her about the invisible unit, about the service that wasn't in the records, about the years her father had spent doing things his country had never officially acknowledged. I told her what Colonel Marsh had said, that Walter Greer was one of the best people he had ever known. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He never told us any of that." I said, "I know," she said. "He should have found a way." I thought about the journal entry. I think I believed that living it was enough proof. I thought about what it must be like to come home from something like that, something that didn't officially exist, and try to re-enter a life in which none of it had happened. I thought about the weight of carrying something for 44 years with no one to share it with. And I thought about my grandfather calling me every Sunday at 7 in the evening, consistently and without fail, because I was the one who answered. I said, "He was trying. I think he didn't know how." My mother cried. I hadn't heard my mother cry in years, and I didn't know what to do with it. We talked for a long time that night, longer than we'd talked in years, and some of what we said was hard and some of it was past due, and none of it resolved everything. But it was something. It was a start. I don't know what it means for us going forward. I'm still figuring that out. With Colonel Marsh's help, I filed the appropriate requests and eventually received a partial acknowledgement of my grandfather's service, not the full record, because parts of it still carry classification designations that won't expire in my lifetime, but enough. Enough to know that what he did was real, and that it mattered, and that the Army knew it mattered even if it could never say so publicly. I arranged for a proper military funeral. It was 7 months after his death, later than it should have been. I know, but Walter Greer got his flag, folded and presented with the precision and gravity it deserved, and he got his rifle salute, 3 crisp volleys that echoed off the trees on a cold November morning. Colonel Marsh was there. Deanna and her husband were there. My mother came. She stood very straight and didn't speak much, but she came. I stood at the graveside and held the flag and thought about a man who had spent 44 years carrying something in silence, because silence was what had been asked of him. I thought about the journal entry one more time. I think I believed that living it was enough proof, and I thought about how wrong he was and how completely I understood why he believed it. When you have done things that cannot be discussed in any room you're likely to stand in, you start to believe that the weight of the doing is visible somehow, that people can see it in you without being told. You forget that invisibility is exactly what you were trained for. You forget that you got too good at it. I placed the coin at the base of the headstone. Colonel Marsh had offered to help me find the proper regimental coin that went with it, a pair, apparently, the way these things worked, but I wanted Walter's to stay with him. It seemed right. It seemed like returning something to its owner. The flag is on my wall now. When I look at it, I don't think about the years he spent alone in that house. I try not to, anyway. I think about the Sunday phone calls. I think about the voice that always said you didn't have to come when I showed up, and the hand that always reached back when I took it. He was wrong about that too. Of course I had to come. There was no version of anything in which I didn't come. I've thought about why I'm telling this story, and the honest answer is this. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world doing enormous things and receiving no acknowledgement for them, and these people are not rare. They are in your families. They are sitting at the edge of the room at your Thanksgiving table, quiet in a way you've probably described as standoffish or difficult. They are calling you on Sunday evenings at 7 because you're the one who answers. And the thing about them is that they will almost never tell you what they carry. Not because they don't want to be known, but because they were taught by circumstances, by duty, by a long practice of self-erasure that the knowing was not available to them. Pay attention to the quiet ones. Not in a sentimental way, not as a project, just in the ordinary way of being present to the person in front of you. Ask the follow-up question. Stay on the phone 1 minute longer than you planned to. Go when they say you didn't have to. Walter Greer served this country in silence for years that will never appear in any official history. He came home and he lived his life and he called his granddaughter on Sundays, and he died the way he had lived without asking for anything he hadn't already given. He deserved better. Most quiet people do. If you have someone like that in your life, someone who never interrupts, never announces, never claims credit for any of it, I hope you'll think about them today. I hope you'll reach out. I hope you won't wait, the way I almost waited, until there's nothing left but a metal box on a high shelf and a journal entry about the things that went unexplained. There is still time. For most of you. Use it.